The ice storm that had been grinding through the West Virginia foothills for 3 days didn't negotiate. It came in sideways, coating every surface in a skin of gray glaze, and it had no opinion about the fact that Cassidy Falk had survived 2 deployments, a crash landing in the Helmand Valley, and 11 months of running from people who very much wanted her in the ground. She was 28 years old, and she felt 90. Wedged into the corner behind the collapsed cashier's counter of an abandoned Citgo station off Route 33, Cassidy had pulled her knees up to her chest and wrapped gaunt arms around the shivering animal pressed against her, Havoc. 82 pounds of Belgian Malinois, built like a sprung trap, trained to disarm men twice Cassidy's size, was trembling in a way that had nothing to do with the cold. He'd been trembling like that for 6 days now. A low, irregular tremble that started somewhere deep in his abdomen and radiated outward, like something inside him was slowly losing the argument. Cassidy pressed her cheek against the top of his head, his fawn-colored fur damp with melted ice. She'd given him the last of her beef jerky 2 hours ago. She hadn't eaten since the day before. "I've got you," she whispered. Her breath fogged in the frigid air. "I've got you, bud. Just hold on." Holding on was something they'd gotten very good at. 11 months of sleeping in the beds of strangers' pickup trucks, in the back rooms of cash-only diners, in culverts and storm drains, and once, memorably, in the hayloft of a barn in Kentucky, while a military police cruiser idled on the road 50 feet below. 11 months of paying for everything in crumpled cash, of never giving a real name, of scanning every room she walked into for the nearest exit. The government had a word for what Cassidy was, deserter. They had another word for what she'd taken when she left, theft of classified government property. Cassidy had a different word for it, survival. It had started in a village outside Deir ez-Zor, Syria, 13 months ago. A compound raid, routine intelligence extraction, in theory. Cassidy and Havoc had been clearing the eastern wing when the dog locked onto something under a broken desk with the single-minded precision of a Malinois who trusted his training completely. He'd nosed it free, a small titanium capsule, roughly the size of an olive, designed to protect a micro-SD card from blast damage, water, and crushing force, the kind of casing that intelligence assets use to protect critical data in hostile environments. Before Cassidy could bag and tag it, the compound took fire from the north side. They pulled out hard and fast, and in the chaos, she didn't realize until they were back at base that Havoc had done exactly what his training dictated when he couldn't safely transfer a small retrieved object to his handler during active fire. He'd swallowed it. She hadn't thought much of it at the time. It happened occasionally. The object would pass. Then, the next morning, Colonel Stuart Payne had called Cassidy into his office. Payne was a career officer who moved through the world as though he were doing it a favor. He sat behind his desk with the posture of a man who'd spent decades ensuring no one forgot his rank, and he delivered the news about Havoc the way a person discusses weather they find inconvenient. The dog had demonstrated unpredictable behavioral issues during the raid, Payne said. Possible neurological liar event. He'd been flagged as a liar. The base veterinarian had already signed the paperwork. Euthanasia was scheduled for the following morning. Cassidy had asked to adopt him. Payne had smiled, a thin, precise thing, and said the transfer couldn't be approved given the dog's classification. What he didn't say, but what Cassidy saw clearly in the flatness behind his eyes, he wasn't worried about Havoc's behavior. He was worried about what was inside Havoc's stomach. She'd asked around quietly that night. One of the intel analysts, a corporal who owed Cassidy a favor from Kandahar, pulled the compound profile. The capsule format matched a field recording device used by a Tier 1 unit operating in the same region. A unit that had reported the device missing after a firefight 3 weeks earlier. The device would have contained encrypted video. Cassidy didn't sleep that night. She thought about the way Payne had looked when he told her about the euthanasia order. Not inconvenienced, urgent. At 0230, she walked into the veterinary hold, sedated Havoc with a dose from the medical cabinet, wrapped him in her field jacket, and walked off the base. She'd been walking ever since. The sound that broke through the howl of ice against the Citgo's broken windows wasn't wind. It was footsteps, deliberate, unhurried, crossing the gravel lot towards the station's side entrance. Cassidy was on her feet. Before the sound registered, consciously, hand closing around the heavy tactical flashlight on her belt. Havoc's head came up, amber eyes cutting through the dark toward the door, but he didn't bark. He was too weak to bark. The side door opened. A figure stepped inside, old, female, wearing a long charcoal wool coat with a fox fur collar, moving with a cane tipped in polished steel. She carried a battery-powered lantern in her other hand and held it up, illuminating the space with calm efficiency, as though walking into abandoned gas stations during ice storms was simply part of her Tuesday. The woman was old, not frail. There was a difference, and this woman was a clear example of it. Her white hair was pinned precisely under a wool cap. Her eyes, pale gray, nearly colorless, assessed the room and landed on Cassidy with the directness of a rifle scope. "You're going to freeze to death in here," the woman said. Her voice was dry as old paper, carrying the faint trace of a Tidewater, Virginia accent. "And the dog is already in organ distress. I can hear it in his breathing from the doorway." Cassidy's grip tightened on the flashlight. "Who are you?" "My name is Agnes Thorne." The old woman's eyes dropped to Havoc, then to the tactical vest he still wore, a Naval Special Warfare K9 harness, grimy and frayed but unmistakable. Her expression didn't change. "And that is a Belgian Malinois in a SEAL K9 unit harness, which means you are an attached handler. And given that you are sheltering in an abandoned gas station in January, instead of reporting to your unit, I am going to make an educated guess that you took him without authorization." Cassidy's throat went dry. "I don't know what you're talking about." "Yes, you do." Agnes said it quietly, without drama. "Specialist Falk, my car is on the road. It's warm. My house is 4 miles from here. If that dog doesn't get somewhere warm in the next hour, he won't survive the night." She paused. "You can point that flashlight at me the entire way if it makes you feel better, but we need to go now." Cassidy looked at Havoc. The Malinois's sides were heaving with shallow, rapid breaths. His eyes were half closed. She picked up the dog and followed the old woman into the ice. Agnes Thorne's house was a federal-style farmhouse at the end of a gravel lane, its windows lit gold against the black storm. Inside it was warm, radiator heat, deep and bone-penetrating, and it smelled of cedar and coffee and something Cassidy eventually identified as gun oil. The walls of the front room were covered in shadow boxes and framed photographs, citations, service ribbons, a naval officer's dress cover behind glass, a folded flag in a triangular case. Agnes set Havoc down on a heavy wool blanket near the radiator and disappeared into the kitchen without ceremony. Cassidy stood guard over the dog, eyes moving across the photographs. In the largest one, a man in navy dress whites stood on the deck of a carrier. The rank insignia on his shoulders made Cassidy go still. Rear Admiral. Agnes returned with a tray. Hot coffee, chicken broth, a shallow bowl of plain rice with shredded chicken that she set beside Havoc without comment. The Malinois lifted his head at the smell, and Cassidy fed him by hand, small amounts, watching his sides expand with each careful swallow. Only when the bowl was empty, and Havoc's head had dropped back onto the blanket, did Cassidy pick up the broth and drink it standing. "You didn't ask how I know your name," Agnes said, settled in a straight-backed chair across the room. "I was working up to it." Cassidy's voice was flat. "Who are you, really?" "I told you who I am. My late husband was Rear Admiral Frederick Thorne." Agnes folded her hands over the head of her cane. "He spent 31 years in naval intelligence. In his final year of service, He became aware that a senior officer was conducting unauthorized surveillance operations in Syria, not sanctioned by any theater command, generating intelligence that was being selectively sold to private contractors. She paused. The officer's name was Colonel Stuart Payne. Cassidy set the mug down very carefully on the edge of a side table. Frederick filed a formal complaint with the Inspector General 14 months ago. Agnes's voice stayed level, but her hands tightened almost imperceptibly around the cane. 6 weeks after he filed, he had a cardiac event while driving on Route 17. The road was empty, no other vehicles. He drove off an embankment at 60 miles an hour. She looked at Cassidy directly. Frederick had passed a full cardiac exam 30 days prior. No history of heart disease, no warning signs. The fire in the cast-iron stove clicked and settled. Outside, ice ticked against the windows like fingernails. The compound you raided in Deir ez-Zor, Agnes continued, had been used as a drop point for Payne's operation. The device your dog retrieved was a field recorder planted by the same Tier 1 unit, investigating Payne under Inspector General authorization. It contained 14 hours of encrypted footage. She reached into the pocket of her coat and set a sealed envelope on the table between them, including footage of Colonel Payne personally ordering the execution of 3 unarmed prisoners in a holding room. On camera, face clearly visible. Cassidy's jaw tightened. He wasn't trying to retire the dog because of behavioral issues. No. Agnes's pale eyes didn't waver. He needed to recover the recorder before anyone realized what was on it. When you took Havoc, you walked off that base with the only surviving copy of evidence that would put him in federal prison for the rest of his life. He has been hunting you for 11 months. A pause. He found you 3 days ago. A contractor. No government footprint. Checked into a motel in Elkins yesterday. He had a photograph of you and the dog. Cassidy's hand moved toward her belt. Then we need to leave. You need to listen to me. Agnes stood, unhurried, and held Cassidy's gaze with the authority of a woman who had learned to deliver devastating information without flinching. I have spent 14 months building the case my husband died to make. I have contacts at the Inspector General's office waiting for that recording, but I cannot send them something I don't have. She let that settle. Right now, that device is inside your dog, and it has been for 11 months. She reached back into the envelope and withdrew a sheet of film, a veterinary X-ray, gray and white, the kind that required a trained eye to read. She didn't need to explain where she'd obtained it. She simply held it where Cassidy could see the bright white rectangular shape glowing in the center of the abdominal cavity. The titanium capsule was not designed to remain in a living animal's digestive tract for nearly a year, Agnes said quietly. It has migrated. It is creating a toxic obstruction that is no longer responding to the body's attempts to compensate. What you believe is illness from exhaustion and malnutrition. She paused. Is the capsule failing? His organs are beginning to follow. The room seemed to contract around Cassidy. She looked at Havoc on the blanket, his ribs rising and falling too fast, too shallow. She had spent 11 months convinced she was protecting him. She had spent 11 months keeping him alive. The guilt that moved through her chest was cold and total. We have to operate tonight, Agnes said. I anticipated this. There is someone here. She crossed the room and opened the back hallway door. A man in his early 70s stepped in, wearing clean clothes and carrying a stainless steel medical case with the practiced ease of someone who'd carried one for decades. His face was weathered, and his hands were steady. This is Dr. Leonard Haas, Agnes said. Chief veterinary surgeon at Naval Station Norfolk for 22 years. He served under my husband. He has prepared a sterile surgical suite in the basement. Dr. Haas looked at Cassidy and gave a single measured nod. His vitals are poor but not incompatible with anesthesia. If we move now, we have a reasonable chance. A pause. If we wait until morning, we don't. Cassidy knelt beside Havoc. The Malinois found her face immediately with his amber eyes. even now, even barely conscious, tracking her, waiting for the signal that told him what came next. She put her palm flat on his chest and felt his heartbeat working too fast and too hard against her hand. "Okay," she said, "do it." Dr. Haas and Cassidy carried Havoc down the cellar stairs into a room Agnes had outfitted with methodical precision. Stainless steel table, portable surgical lamp, a cardiac monitor glowing green in the low light. The space smelled sharply of antiseptic. Dr. Haas moved to his equipment with quiet economy. "You'll need to wait upstairs," he said. Cassidy looked at Havoc one last time, then she climbed back up the stairs. The house was dark except for the stove's ember glow. Agnes stood at the front window, her silhouette motionless against the ice-smeared glass. Neither of them spoke. Then the porch lantern went out, not wind, the exterior breaker cut from outside. Agnes didn't startle. "He's on the property," she said, exactly as calm as before. Cassidy was already moving to the window at an angle, staying out of the sight line. A single set of footprints crossed the lane from the east tree line, professional spacing, unhurried. He wasn't running because he didn't think he needed to. "Stay near the stove," Cassidy said, "low and away from the windows. I have managed worse situations than this in my own home." Agnes reached into the drawer of the secretary desk beside her and withdrew a Sig Sauer P226 with the composure of a woman retrieving her reading glasses. She checked the chamber without looking down. "Go." Cassidy went. She moved through the hallway by feel, back flat against the wall, letting her eyes calibrate to the darkness she'd trained in. The sound came from the rear of the house. The mudroom door opened with careful precision. Good lock work. He was already inside. She tracked him by floorboard. 3 steps, a pause, 2 steps, moving toward the stove's glow, toward Agnes, toward the one light source in the house. She stepped out of the hallway behind him and drove the heavy end of the tactical flashlight into the back of his weapon arm with everything her starved body had left. The rifle clattered sideways. He was fast, faster than she'd wanted, and he spun and drove an elbow into her jaw that sent white crackling through her vision. They went down together into the dining table, scattering chairs across the hardwood. He got a forearm across her throat and his full weight behind it, and Cassidy bucked and twisted, but couldn't break the angle. Her vision was pulling in at the edges. "Payne sends his regards," the man said. The shot was enormous in the enclosed space. The pressure on Cassidy's throat vanished. She rolled free and looked up. Agnes Thorne stood in the doorway to the front room, the Sig Sauer held level in both hands, her posture composed as if she were standing at a lectern. The man lay still on the dining room floor. The antique clock on the wall continued its measured ticking, as though nothing of particular consequence had occurred. Agnes lowered the weapon. "In my home," she said evenly, "no one delivers regards on behalf of a war criminal." She said it the way a woman states a rule about taking shoes off at the door. The intercom panel on the hallway wall crackled. Dr. Haas's voice came through, tired, steady, and something underneath that was unmistakably relief. "Specialist Falk, surgery is complete, I have the capsule, and Havoc is stable, he's going to be fine." Cassidy sat down on the dining room floor and pressed the heels of her hands against her eyes, and didn't say anything at all for a long time. The encrypted files were transmitted to the DoD Inspector General's office via secure relay 48 hours later, accompanied by 14 months of documentation Agnes had assembled with the patience of a woman who had nothing left to lose and every reason to be thorough. The footage was unambiguous, the faces were clear, the timestamps were intact. Colonel Stuart Payne was arrested at his desk at the Pentagon on a Tuesday morning, flanked by federal agents and military investigators who had been quietly waiting for exactly this moment. He was court-martialed, stripped of all rank and decorations, and sentenced to life in federal prison without parole, for war crimes, conspiracy to commit murder, and the verified deaths of Rear Admiral Frederick Thorne and 3 others whose endings had been attributed, until now, to other causes. The presidential pardon for Cassidy came through 3 weeks later. Her honorable discharge was reinstated. Her back pay and full veterans' benefits were restored. The paperwork arrived at Agnes's house by courier on a grey February afternoon, and Cassidy sat in the front room and read every page twice before she believed what she was holding. The last document in the packet was a single page from the Department of the Navy. It bore an official seal and 7 lines of formal language that transferred legal ownership of military working dog Havoc, service number K9MWD441, to specialist Cassidy Falk permanently and without condition. Havoc was on the wool blanket near the radiator. He was wearing a new orthopedic wrap on his left foreleg, a secondary injury Dr. Haas had repaired during the surgery, and he was working at the corner of a dried antler with the focused commitment of a dog who had decided that life was on balance, worth the effort. His amber eyes found Cassidy the moment she looked at him, and his tail moved twice, slow, deliberate, certain. Agnes came in from the kitchen carrying 2 cups of coffee, moving without particular hurry. "You've been staring at those papers for 20 minutes, Agnes observed. "I keep expecting them to disappear." Cassidy folded the transfer document along its crease and held it. "We should probably start thinking about where we go from here." Agnes set 1 cup on the side table and looked around the room. The photographs on the walls, the folded flag in its case, the dog on the blanket, the chair where her husband had sat for 30 years, with an expression that was quiet and, for the first time since Cassidy had known her, something that looked like peace. Frederick always said this house was built for more people than one person could fill. Agnes settled into her chair with the unhurried gravity of someone who had nowhere else to be and knew it. "Dr. Haas is already complaining that the garden is too large for one man to manage in the spring. And that dog—" She nodded toward Havoc, who had abandoned the antler and was watching Cassidy with the steady, uncomplicated patience of an animal, simply waiting to see what came next, "is going to need somewhere proper to recover. Somewhere with a yard and room to run when he's ready." Cassidy looked at Agnes, then she looked at Havoc. 11 months of running, and the dog had never once asked her where they were going. He'd just gone. For the first time in over a year, she didn't have an answer that involved leaving. "Yes, ma'am," Cassidy said. "I think you might be right.